Welcome to episode 2 of 400 Years Later. This podcast looks at Shakespeare's tragedies to better understand today's issues. Last week, we focused on Titus Andronicus and the Me Too movement. Today, we'll still be looking at the Me Too movement, but instead how it relates to one of Shakespeare's sonnets, The Rape of Lucrece. We have with us today an excellent and super smart guest, Leah Rosen. She is a senior Greek and Roman studies major, and we're super delighted to have her here today. So, Leah, first, could you just answer us the quick question that I like to ask all of my guests? Why are Shakespeare's works still important for us to know and learn today, 400 years later?
Shakespeare's a really interesting figure because I think his works really speak to a lot of the essentials of human experience that don't really go away even as society changes and even as, we get less sexist and racist that we see in a lot of his works. We just finished reading Hamlet, which talks a lot about grief and a lot about how we sort of process that, as well as vengeance and our relationship to other people. And I think that is still very relevant to us today, even as our language and even as our perspective on the world shifts.
Wow. So now, seeing as how you're our resident expert in Greek and Roman studies, I was wondering if you would be able to provide us a brief summary of the myth of the Rape of Lucrece. Obviously, Shakespeare didn't come up with this story on his own. It has ancient origins. Could you talk on that?
Yeah, so the Rape of Lucrece, or as it's kind of known in the Roman myths, the Rape of Lucretia, is part of the mytho-history of ancient Rome. So we know the later emperors of Rome really well with Augustus and, of course, the Roman Republic. But before all of that, they did have kings. And this period of their history, because it was very ancient history, even to, I'm referencing today Livy, it was very old history, even to Livy then. And so it's really entwined with fiction and with myth in order to create this sort of grand thematic founding story for the Romans. And so the Rape of Lucretia, and I'm referencing, in case, your listeners want to look at it, Ad Urbe Condita by Livy, which is from the founding of the city. This story is specifically from Book 1, chapter 57 to 60. Basically, what it's about is the, spoiler alert, final king of Rome has this son. I know him as Tarquinius Superbus, and another gentleman, I believe Collatinus, are at a party, and they make this bet, basically to see who has the better wife. And so the two men, they go and they visit Tarquinius's wife, and she's boozing, she's having a great time with her friends, she's living it up. And then they go to see Latinus, his wife, Lucretia, and she is at home, she is at her loom, and she is working, and she greets her husband, and it's this scene of womanly virtue, very much the Roman ideal of someone who stays in the home, someone who's very modest, someone who's very chaste. And so they determine that Lucretia is the better wife, but Tarquinius sees her, he sees her beauty, but also, quite interestingly, as Livy points out, it was there that Sextus Tarquinius was seized with a wicked desire to debauch Lucretia by force. Not only her beauty, but her proved chastity as well provoked him. And so what's really interesting there is it's not only her elegance, but also that sort of idealized version of the Roman woman who is very chaste, very modest, very at home working all the time, that is blamed for why he chooses to rape her. And so a few days he comes back, he pulls out a sword, and he rapes Lucretia. And of course, it's this very tragic scene, but the way that Livy lays it out is that even as he's like, hey, I'm going to do this or I'm going to kill you, she refuses him and she refuses him until at last he threatens that he's going to kill a slave, put that man's body in bed next to her, kill her, and then slander her reputation. At which point she finally is forced to give in. And the following day, she brings her father and she brings her husband to her. She tells them what happens, and she says, I am going to take my own life. You need to kill that guy. And they try and persuade her. They're like, you don't need to die about it. And she insists that she does. I'm going to pull out another quote I think is interesting in how Livy discusses this topic. She said, "It is for you to determine," she answers, "what is due to him. For my own part, though I acquit myself of the sin, I do not absolve myself from punishment. Not in time to come shall ever unchaste women live through the example of Lucretia." And then she takes her own life. And with that sort of being the nail in the coffin for the monarchy, they have been tyrants up to this point. Her family and her husband rally the people, and they drive the Tarquins out, and they instill the Republic.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was a terrific summary. Thank you for that. And of course, there's variations on who, depending on who is telling the story. Of course, you just spoke to us about Livy's telling of it, but there's also Ovid, and I know ancient historians have reported this story as well. And then, of course, today we're looking at Shakespeare's version in his sonnet, which differs very slightly. Same idea, pretty much still hitting all of the points. So one thing that I found interesting is that Tarquin is a person of power, and he's a king, and he threatens Lucretia, who's just a housewife. And it reminded me similarly of Lavinia and Titus Andronicus. Demetrius and Chiron are sons of royalty. And so there's a weird power dynamic going in there that unfortunately we see a lot even still today. So I thought that parallel was really interesting right off the bat. Of course, like you said earlier, it's a story of the founding of the Republic. So no wonder it has to start with a king, right?
Right.
But one thing I found really interesting in Shakespeare's sonnet is Lucrece, which I'll just use the names interchangeably because it would be too much for my mind to settle on one and stick to it. But she seeks community, it seems like, from other women, even though they're not actually live, real women with her. For instance, in Shakespeare's sonnet, I don't know if this is in Livy's version, but she goes and looks at a painting of the siege of Troy, and she settles in on Hecuba, who was the queen of Troy and widow of King Priam. I had to look all of this up. I'm not an expert as yourself. I did have to consult my brother too. He also was Greek and Roman studies. But anyway, so as Colin Burrow points out in his introduction to Shakespeare's poem, Lucrece immediately thinks of the rest of the story of the siege of Troy and the Trojan War, and sees Sinon's betrayal synonymous to Tarquin's. So if I understand correctly, which please let me know if I don't, Sinon was a Greek man who was found by the Trojans, and he basically was the one that encouraged them to welcome the Trojan horse because it would have been a bad omen for the Greeks. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm not great with the names, but somebody definitely did that, so that sounds right.
Okay. So I found it interesting that that's who Lucretia is identifying as Tarquin in her own life, because as Burrow later points out, this isn't a perfect match to what's happened to her. I mean, Hecuba wasn't raped. It's not like Sinon raped anyone like Tarquin did. But rather, as Burrow points out, this is a result of Lucrece trying to mold her own trauma into one that she already knows and a story that she's familiar with. And a quote from Burrow: "Lucrece's grief seeks to find vehicles, but the vehicles it finds are other people's stories rather than her own, approximations of grief rather than expressions of her grief's true quality." So I find that interesting. And of course, we're humans. We do the same even today, right? Looking toward maybe other people rather than ancient stories. But I feel like we're always trying to find some other story to compare our own pain to. Do you feel like that's accurate?
I do. And that's very, very interesting that Shakespeare has her making those comparisons, especially when that doesn't appear in the Livy. And so I find that really interesting, but also because we saw in Titus Andronicus, the myth that he chose to sort of reference was such a direct parallel. And so to kind of like add on these details, and I'm sure we know that Shakespeare was looking at ancient sources, and so I'm not sure what he was looking at. He very much could have pulled those details from there. But to lean into that sort of imperfect comparison is a really interesting choice.
Yeah, I thought so too. And then, furthermore, in her complaint against the knight, she actually says if Tarquin was the knight, he surely would rape the moon, which, as we know, is goddess Diana. And a quote from the sonnet itself, and this is Lucrece speaking: "So should I have co-partners in my pain, and fellowship in woe doth woe assuage, as palmers' chat makes short their pilgrimage." So when I first read this, I thought to myself, okay, Lucrece is thinking if there were some other survivor who I could identify with and share in my pain and my burden, then maybe that would, not be so heavy on me. You always think of an electric shock, lightning bolt. You hold hands, it's less pain on everybody. Now, I'm not a survivor myself, so I don't know the validity of that, but I can't help but wonder, you know, would that have helped her? In Shakespeare's sonnet, it's so almost infuriating as a woman reader in the 21st century, because she cries to her maid and has her maid call for her husband and her dad and everyone. And the maid asks her so many times, "Why are you crying? What's happened? What's wrong?" And she doesn't tell her. And I understand that. Obviously there's a lot of shame in the ancient times of what's happened to her. But I can't help but wonder, man, if she had shared with another woman, preferably someone who has survived her own trauma, would her decision to kill herself, would that have come out differently? What are your initial reactions to that?
No, yeah. I mean, it's always hard to speculate about history and about myths and what could have been, but I think you raise an excellent point. You definitely feel, and I think the poem and the Livy version as well, sort of the weight of that cultural expectation, both in how she's internalized it, but also how even the people around her, even as they're trying to say, no, no, please live, do sort of hold her accountable and blame her for this horrible thing that has happened to her. Where the Livy really frames it as, look at how admirable she is. This is tragic, but look at how admirable she is for resisting, as if it was her choice either way, as well as for that kind of final line that she says before she dies of, "Will let no unchaste woman compare herself to me," as if in some way this is their fault, even so, like projecting blame so far into the future of women who will suffer these experiences and saying, well, you should have been more like me and you should do what I do, and sort of setting this example of, ladies, be like Lucretia. I think maybe it is that larger Roman culture that did sort of prevent her from confiding in these other women. And I think if there had been like a larger societal support and culture of women being able to support women, which obviously I'm not an expert. I don't really know what the interpersonal lives of women were like in ancient Rome, but to have that sort of opportunity to share that, I do think really would have helped, because it wouldn't have had so much pressure of being like, well, it was your fault actually, and it is shameful.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I One thing that I found kind of interesting was also in Colin Burrow's introduction. He states that Lucrece may have wanted to kill herself, and potentially the fetus she was carrying, because if she were to become pregnant, Elizabethan laws at the time would assume that she consented to sex. So, like, the laws surrounding rape were super messed up to today's standards, and so messed up that if you were raped and you later became pregnant, the law would interpret that as your body allowed it and you consented somehow. So therefore, you weren't actually raped.
Wow.
So his point is that, well, maybe she's so compelled, of course, because of shame, of course, because this is the society she's grown up in and all of the ideas that she's internalized, but maybe also because she wants to preserve that rape claim and not be discounted later if she does become pregnant, which I thought was super interesting. I never knew that that was ever the law in England, but it just makes me wonder, what went into her decision and how could the voices of other women maybe have swayed her decision. So the other day, I was scrolling through TikTok, as one does in our Gen Z generation, and there was this account, and they were talking about a new book that's been published, and it's called The Bonobo Sisterhood by Diane Rosenfeld. And what she's trying to do in this book is attack the traditional psychological belief that men are predisposed to be violent towards women. And Rosenfeld does this by looking at bonobos, which are apparently akin to chimpanzees. And what's really interesting about them, and they're isolated in the animal kingdom in this way, is that they have strong social connections. So, and this is a quote from that TikTok, the account, The Law Says What? If a female bonobo is attacked by a male, she lets out a special cry, which signals other female bonobos, even those that don't know her, to rush to her defense. And that system is so effective that actually male bonobos don't even attack female bonobos, like very rarely, because they know if they do, this whole army of female bonobos is going to come to her defense. And it makes me, of course that's inspiring. We want our own society to strive toward that standard. And that's where the Me Too movement is presumably aiming to go, is to build community among survivors and help them advocate for accountability. But again, I can't help but wonder, Lucrece had all of these mythical predecessors, and of course she's a myth herself, but never mind that. She had no one she could really see in her own world, in her own life, and know this other woman has experienced the same trauma as me, and I can have a conversation with her. And it just makes me think, we always say there's power in numbers, and of course I strive for a society where women can join hands, and not just women, let me be complete, not just women, but where survivors can join hands and fight against a patriarchal society where sexual violence against women is so normalized. So yeah, I just can't help but wonder, would having those conversations with others have changed the way she experienced her shame and guilt and commitment to the state and purity and chastity? Of course, we can't know this. Like you said earlier, this is all speculation, but I think it's good food for thought. And so, yeah, any other thoughts?
I think you raise a great point, and I think that, looking at the real world and looking at the bonobos, community really does help. And so I think you raise a great point that, if she had actually had somebody, and if maybe Roman society maybe facilitated those kinds of communities, maybe things could have turned out differently.
Yeah, I mean, even in Shakespeare's sonnet, her dad and her husband come, and finally, I mean, it's super heart-wrenching. It takes her forever to be able to actually communicate what's happened. But once she finally does, and she kills herself, the family argues over who she was closest to and whose pain is the biggest. Which of course we see in Titus Andronicus. Titus adopts Lavinia's crime to be his own and really kind of steals that pain from her. And so it's just she's not surrounded, in my definition, by a great network of helpful, caring, nurturing people.
Yeah, they kind of made it about them.
Yeah. And maybe we do today too. Maybe things haven't changed as much as we think they have. Well, this is pretty much all I had planned. I thank you for coming in on this rainy, gloomy day and having a conversation with me, even though you had to walk through the pouring rain.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk about Shakespeare and also Greek and Roman studies.
Yeah, of course. Well, we valued your expertise. I can only do so much by reading Wikipedia articles and watching YouTube animated videos on legends and myths. So I really appreciate it. I think you added a lot of insight to my own train of thought on this. So thanks for coming.
Thanks.
All right. Next week on 400 Years Later, we'll be looking at Shakespeare's tragedy Hamlet and seeing how Hamlet interacts with his mother and projects onto his mother. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you so much to Leah Rosen and, of course, to Professor Diaz. Bye.